Hi all, and welcome. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council, and we are in today for a special treat. There's a very interesting new book called Republics of Myth, National Narratives and the US-Iran Conflict. It is a concise history of US-Iran relations, particularly since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and it looks at all the extreme ups and downs of that relationship through an interesting lens, that of national narratives. We're very lucky we have all three authors with us today virtually, although I'm afraid our fourth panelist, Holly Dogres, is under the weather today. So I'm going to try to incorporate her perspective into my questions. As always, we want you to participate. Please, as the discussion continues, put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to obviously look at the past, but we're going to also try to project some of the analysis forward, look at where we are in US-Iran relations, maybe even make some recommendations that might put us on a less mutually destructive path. So without further ado, we're going to start with John Tierman, who is Executive Director and Principal Research Scientist at the MIT Center for International Studies. John was one of the first people who reached out to me after I published a book on US-Iran relations some 15 years ago. And so I am delighted to be able to return the favor. So John, if you could please unmute yourself and explain, first of all, how long it took you to put this book together and why you chose this particular angle of national narratives to frame the book, and also explain what those narratives are.
Sure, thank you, Barbara, and it's a pleasure to be with you. The audience probably knows what a first-rate journalist you've been, particularly on Iran, and so we have a very knowledgeable moderator today, which is a pleasure. The book we put together after a series of 5 conferences, critical oral history conferences, we call them, because they bring together policymakers, documents, often from FOIA research, and scholars to look at a particular event or series of events. Over a period of something like 15 or 16 years, we've done this and published now 3 books. The current book is sort of a culmination. Republics of Myth takes on the whole of US-Iran relations, as Barbara noted, mainly since 1979. And it puts forward a relatively novel thesis, and that is that it's not just national interests that drive behavior, but also national narratives. Now, what do we mean by national narratives? Narratives are stories about a nation, their folklore, they are facts to some extent, history through particular nationalistic lens, and they're conveyed through education, the news media, art, architecture, all kinds of ways that we imbibe our own national narratives, and it goes on for many, many years, and it has in both of these countries. And our view of this is that narratives can often be a subtle shaper of political leaders' behavior and decisions and what happens between 2 countries. And that is what is being examined in this book. Now, the narratives of the 2 countries, I'll just very briefly say. In Iran, it is really 2 different narratives that overlap to some extent. One is the one that's become predominant since 1979, and that is about the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, was involved in a power struggle to lead Islam and was martyred killed in battle in the 7th century of the Christian era. And this has become a very powerful story for Iranians. And again, I won't go into the details, but for our purposes here, one of the most important things to take away from this is a very deep suspicion of foreigners, foreign influence, of the power of martyrdom, and so on. It's a story that's celebrated every year in large street demonstrations in Iran, in Ashura, and it has, I think, in important ways shaped the national political consciousness of the country. In the United States, the master narrative, in our view, is the frontier myth. It's been articulated so well by the cultural historian Richard Slotkin, among others. And this is about the origins of the European era here, and that is with the Puritans, who self-defined their presence here as an errand to the wilderness, just to tame the wilderness, reap its bounty, and subdue the savages that inhabited the wilderness all across the continent. And of course, the savages were the indigenous tribes that we did indeed subdue with great efficiency. The frontier myth is important because politicians and others, cultural leaders and so on, had constantly referred to the frontier as a place where democracy was born, in a sense, where self-reliance was the most important value, and so on. And many prominent politicians, including people like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and others, really looked to the frontier and the closing of the frontier at the end of the 19th century as a national crisis. And so they projected to have frontier, a new American frontier abroad. They had in mind mostly China and stepping stones like the Philippines. But it became, again, it became a very powerful idea in the American cultural and political realm, eventually being prominent in Korea and Vietnam, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places where we actually went to war to subdue the savages and reap the bounty. Now, as it happens, these two myths, or these two national narratives, are very much at odds with each other. The Iranian one, as I said, suspicious of foreigners, it's even in the preamble of their constitution, and they act that out. And the American one, expansionist, some would say imperialist, and constantly searching for places to civilize, quote unquote, but also to reap the bounty. So these have come into a clash of two national narratives that explains, I think, a lot of the behavior of the countries and the relationship to each other. I'll just give you a very quick idea of how this does play out. One is to say, well, these are old ideas. What makes you think they're still as vital as they may have been at one time or another? Well, if you look at Iran, just very recently, there's been a controversy inside Iran about COVID vaccines, which the supreme leader has declared the ones that are made in the United States, particularly, are not usable in Iran because of the poisoning of the Iranian people, potential poisoning. A really, paranoid kind of reaction, but one in keeping with lots of other examples we could give. On the American side, I would say that the, cowboys and Indians motifs may be a little old, but we have a gun culture now that really emblemizes a lot of what the frontier myth is about, the role of the gun in this settling, quote unquote, of the continent and beyond, and a lot that comes with it, the sense of individual freedom and responsibility and so on. And we have a Supreme Court decision today that reinforces that. And finally, I'll just say that in the end, we have to regard violence as being very powerful in both national narratives. I think we'll get to that in a little more detail as we go along.
Yes, thank you very much for setting that up. I have a little anecdote of my own to contribute. I was in Europe last week for some meetings with folks working on Iran, and a European who was recently in Tehran mentioned that at the Imam Khomeini airport, there is a giant poster of Qasem Soleimani, who the late head of the Quds Force, who was assassinated by the United States in Iraq in early 2020. And of course, he is the martyr Soleimani. So very, very much playing on that imagery as well. I have a lot of thoughts about narratives, and I'm going to get to them, but I want to go next to Malcolm Byrne, who is a dear colleague and friend of many years. Malcolm deputy directs, but directs research at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, which is a wonderful resource for information about how our government really works. And Malcolm, if you could talk a little bit about the methodology of the book. I know John has said that you had these 5 conferences, which obviously were very important in terms of getting history from people who've taken part in key events. Also, if without betraying confidences, if you could give us a sense of the makeup of these conferences in terms of Iranians, Americans, and so on, who actually were able to take part before COVID. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Really appreciate it. Appreciate being here. I'm going to try to make this as much of a lightning round as possible, and we can get into details and questions later. So we started out looking at this subject through the lens of missed opportunities, which is a concept I will also be happy to get into in more detail later, but don't want to do it right now. But missed opportunities just seemed like it was such a clear feature of the relationship between the US and Iran, and it seemed like such a good way to try to capture the essence of what we had all been witnessing for 3 or 4 decades between those two sides. The methodology John touched on, it's called critical oral history. It was developed by a couple of our initial partners in this venture, Jim Blight and Janet Lang, who used to be at Brown University and then later at the Balsillie School in Ontario. And they used this method to great effect. And our organization, National Security Archive, was fortunate to be part of that process, used it to explore new dimensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the war in Vietnam, and some other topics. So just a little detail about what critical oral history is. It's a combination, as John mentioned, of 3 elements. There are policy veterans, there are scholars, and there are documents. The policy veterans are chosen from different sides, opposing sides, because you don't want people all to be part of the same club and talking about the same things and agreeing with everything. You want a little bit of tension in the room. Their role is to discuss what they did, why they did it, and what they thought the other side was doing. The scholars are there not to pontificate, sadly, but to sort of act as truth keepers. They're the experts. They've read all the literature. Their function is essentially to keep things on the straight and narrow, to hold the policymakers accountable, so that they don't go wandering off into fantasies and fond memories that may or may not be true. And the documents, the third element, are in some ways the most important because they provide the kind of the evidentiary foundation for the discussions. And we spend a lot of time using the Freedom of Information Act and going to presidential libraries and other archives and places around the world, literally, to try to find materials that can be used. We put together these huge briefing books that we present to the participants ahead of time. And it's really a fun thing to watch their eyes light up as they see all of these, these ghosts from the past, these memos that they wrote or that were written to them or about them. And it really starts to spark memories and brings them right back to to that period of time that you're investigating. And it's hard to explain the dynamic that you can often achieve in this kind of an environment. The level of candor and the level of introspection that you usually find from these participants and that derive from these encounters that they're having, not only with their own memories and the past that they are dredging up, and it's not always a happy one, but also because they are encountering their former enemies across the table from themselves. And that really produces some fascinating dialogue. Obviously, you have to be very careful. You have to bring your usual skepticism to bear and be ready to try to verify whatever is being talked about. But that's what you do in any of these types of academic or journalistic ventures. And this turns out to be an incredibly useful tool for doing that. We found some really remarkable participants, I would say, that we were lucky enough to have join us. And talk to us. As John said, we had 5 different meetings, conferences, workshops on the Iran-Iraq War, on the Khobar Towers bombing of 1995, on the 9/11, on the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, so on. So covering a whole period of time and going back to the very beginning of the revolution. So who did we have? I think that all of these people would be well known to you. Tom Pickering, on the American side, Bruce Rydell, General Binny P. of CENTCOM. We had several CIA former analysts and operatives, Chuck Hogan, Tom Twetton. We had Nick Burns, Larry Wilkerson, Jim Dobbins, Megan O'Sullivan, all kinds of people who were directly involved in these policies, but were not so senior. They were not the top levels where you can sometimes run into the risk of people being a little bit too politicized and too concerned about broader issues, and maybe not even as well informed as you really would like them to be. So we don't ever have presidents involved here, for example. That dynamic just doesn't work. We also had people from other countries. Of course, we had Iran represented, but unfortunately, that was where we ran into a real political obstacle. We were never able to field a full group, and that was simply because of politics. We were doing this mostly in the Bush 43 Ahmadinejad period, which was, not the warm and fuzzy time of the Khatami years when I and so many other Westerners were able to go over to Iran and get to know some of these people and have some interesting discussions. But we did manage to get some really useful participation from people like Abbas Maliki, who was a former deputy foreign minister, Hossein Mousavian, who's well known to everybody nowadays, who was had an integral role in the nuclear negotiations, and then later as ambassador to Bonn under Rafsanjani. Right? He has some fascinating accounts to tell of Rafsanjani's great plan to try to open up to the West that got completely ignored and shunted aside by the Americans. We had a couple of sort of side meetings. We met with a British contingent, including Jack Straw and Richard Dalton and Peter Jenkins and others. We had Stanislav de Laboulaye and other people who were directly involved in monitoring Iran's nuclear program. And all of them, I think you had to be very careful in choosing them, because you don't want somebody who isn't willing to open up, who isn't willing to be second guessed, to have their experiences questioned and in fact challenged or even attacked by counterparts or adversaries, former adversaries. And I think we were very lucky in that regard. Even under the best of circumstances, you can't get everybody that you would want to the table. And so we supplemented these big events with dozens of interviews, again, with people that you would probably have on your list. Bill Burns, Wendy Sherman, Sandy Berger, Zal Khalilzad, Patrick Lang. On the Iranian side, we had we made a couple of trips to Tehran, in addition to previous visits that some of us had made earlier, and were able to discuss things with Javad Zarif, with Sadek Kharazi, the younger, Mahmoud Vaezi, Ali Soltanieh, and a number of others who couldn't make it to the meetings because the politics was too rife, but were able to contribute their side. And that was our goal, was to try to get the voices of all sides included there. We even met with some IRGC officials and others like Tim Goldeman and so on. So a lot of interactions with people designed to try to tease out what they were thinking, what the other side was thinking, things that you don't find in the documentary record, much less textbooks. And I think we had quite a lot of success. So just to wrap up, what we ended up doing, as you've heard from John, is we essentially moved from the idea of missed opportunities to national narratives as just one interesting and unexplored angle through which to try to understand the mess that this 40-year relationship has become. And I will end with that and just say that, I'll pass it on essentially to my friend and colleague Huss, who will talk, I think, about some of the specific findings that we made, but happy to discuss any of these aspects in more detail. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And I guess I would say that the theme of my book was missed opportunities. So
there we are. We had a good
yeah, and certainly there were many of them. But let's go to our final author. Hussein Huss Banai is Assistant Professor of International Studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. And I guess we'll come to you for this is also a question from my friend Holly, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, that what you found that surprised you, what had not previously been known. And I have a couple of favorite anecdotes. One of my favorites is about the Iranian and American delegations to the Bonn conference that set up the first post-Taliban government. It was during Ramadan, but the Iranians were traveling, and so they didn't observe the fast, and they found themselves having coffee or tea and cake with the Americans every morning, while other delegations, Muslim delegations, were observing Ramadan. I thought that was a delicious detail, that they essentially were able to sort of cook up a new government for Afghanistan without the other neighbors of Afghanistan or parties having much to do with it. But please let us know what some of your other interesting findings were.
Thank you. Let me join my colleagues by thanking you for hosting us and holding this event, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for giving our book some airing here. In terms of specific findings, I think in terms of major breakthroughs in either events or relationships between individuals that are part of both countries, this book does not attempt to kind of break major ground in that regard, but rather to, and this was something that came up during our conferences, and also by kind of patching together the history of relationship from or the non-relationship from 1979 through the breakthrough years and the Obama years, and then the closing out again. What we kind of happened on more and more was just how, first and foremost, the levels of empathy ebbs and flows between individuals, how the background of particular policymakers and people who either through intermediaries or directly, again, as in the Obama years and the Rouhani Zarif years, can make a major impact in creating new opportunities, but also really closing down some precious windows that just really get closed because people don't have the necessary kind of foreknowledge of the other side or the requisite training to be able to take advantage of those. And there's no shortage of stories like that from the Iranian side and from the American side. One thing I should note that we do very differently here is most of the books on US-Iran relations are either paying attention exclusively to geopolitical dimensions, ideological dimensions, or cultural dimensions, meaning that they either are looking at the relationship in the context of a particular regional problem, let's say Iran-Iraq war or post invasion of Iraq, US occupation of Iraq, and Iran's expanding role in the region, thereafter Hezbollah, Iran's support of Hezbollah or the Palestinian factions, etc. Or look at the ideological makeup of both regimes, what the nature of domestic politics is in each country and how that presents hurdles for each side, or highly culturalist accounts that try to really just see this exclusively through the lens of civilizational identities, kind of a Huntingtonian overall macro frame. And we kind of demur from each of these things. And really one of the pleasures of being part of this 15-year project was that the evidence led us to this particular framing of narratives. After we had begun with multiple kind of overlapping objectives of trying to understand opportunities or the political thinking of particular actors, why it is that they made the decisions they made at particular times, etc. It became very clear to us that these background narratives were actually exercising tremendous control over how these otherwise practically minded worldly, and especially in the case of the United States and some of the European actors that we saw, and some Iranian officials who were, educated in the United States and Europe and had great hopes for making a turn in the kind of the post-revolutionary politics of their country. How despite all those kind of worldliness that we see in the profiles of many individuals, that these narratives actually anchored their views more than was even apparent to them, or to many scholars who write those books exclusively on geopolitics, ideology, or cultural factors.
If I could interrupt you just for 1 second, something just popped into my head. I don't think it's in your book, but it was during the JCPOA negotiations where I think Javad Zarif wagged a finger at John Kerry or Wendy Sherman and said, "Never lecture an Iranian."
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which, yeah, this sense of abused pride,
Yes.
and so on.
Absolutely.
Even in the most West toxified, if you would, Iranian official.
Exactly. And I think this was, John mentioned there are two background narratives to Iran's a story after the revolution. The other one is the kind of the macro narrative of Persian exceptionalism, of Iranian pride in a kind of a civilizational presence that has outlived the United States, especially, but many other Western countries, and has been consistently around for over 2.5 millennia. Those kinds of episodes are kind of legion. You find those time and again, but they kind of prove the thesis here that the narrative itself has become an important participant. And at crucial moments where the narrative has actually been disrupted, the Obama years I credit for this, especially on the part of the United States. Candidate Obama probably would not have been able to when the Democratic nomination, had he not consistently opposed the Iraq War, A, and B, insisting, really, I mean, crucially, we don't give enough credit to this, that he would openly talk with America's enemies, who at that time were represented by, in my view, ogres like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Fidel Castro and Chavez in Venezuela. And he would say openly that he would actually talk, and we should not fear talking to our enemies. That broke a major taboo that really presented a disruption of this narrative of we never talk to these savages, we never talk to pariahs. And that really forced the hand of hardened narrativologists, if you will, like Ali Khamenei, to even also engage in letter writing with then the President of the United States. And I think that, unfortunately, is the exception that proves the rule. It shows after Obama finishes his 2 terms and Trump comes to term, just how powerful narrative can be to bring everyone back to status quo ante, because narratives ultimately are great framing devices for branding the raison d'etre of a political regime. It is the story you tell, the legitimation story about the national interest, about the reason of state. And that story in post-revolutionary Iran is not only one of grievance and pride, but one especially that is attempting to make a new place for a kind of political entity that has been deemed by this liberal world order as unacceptable and pariah-like. So that is something that we find instances of individually throughout all these administrations we have looked at. And one last thing I say, there's a big asymmetry of information, even during the course of our project. When we began this project in 2007, 2008, a lot of the material, background material on this relationship were just simply not available online, or had to painstakingly be put together by great outlets like the National Security Archive. And there were no, although there were a lot of memoirs, there was nowhere near the level of transparency that social media and digital media would bring about. And from the kind of the Obama period and after, even the latter part of the Bush period, you get this great intricate accounts of kind of what's happening in the background, and memoirs even develop a much more open, transparent quality. Bill Burns's memoir, for instance, The Back Channel, is really remarkable because it gives an insight into, just how from the tail end of the Bush administration, which we had discovered through our critical or history conferences, the United States was holding back channel secret talks in Oman with the Iranians, and that became obviously a crucial opening. We contextualized that a great deal with how narrative still directed the ebb and flow of even back channel talks, and how at the sight of the slightest affront or threat to the survival of one particular faction or the other, the status quo ante can once again show its face.
Thank you for that. I'd like to come back to you actually with one sort of follow-up, and others are welcome to join in. It strikes me that the different ways in which the United States and Iran employ violence is one of the core problems, that because of the asymmetry of the relationship and because of Iran's belief that it is entitled to go after its enemies in a rather violent way, including dissidents abroad, you have a pattern where the United States goes in guns blazing, to use your metaphor, into countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. And Iran employs violence in what we define as terrorist actions. Now, not all of those are terrorist actions. For example, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, one could argue, was not terrorism, because the Marines were intervening in the Lebanese conflict. But that is one of the incidents that is a real sore point for a lot of people. You also have Americans who are veterans of the Iraq War who note that Iranian supplied IEDs to Iraqi militias killed hundreds of Americans during that conflict. Now, was that terrorism or was that some other kind of use of violence? But if you could just amplify about the way in which Iran uses violence, the way in which the United States uses violence. I mean, if anything, I would say the Israelis are more like the Iranians in their use of assassination as a technique of pushing forward what they perceive as their national interest.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Barbara. I think, to me, the Achilles heel of Iran's kind of justification of, or its particular brand of violence, as you pointed out, is the use of that violence against its own citizens. What time and again undermines, I think, the Iranian kind of attempt to draw moral equivalence between its actions and that of the United States or other Western or Israeli government, for instance, is that it has employed these same types of violence against its own citizens with brutality of a kind that is really unconscionable, and even against some of its loyalists who have, turned against the regime in late times. Reformists, many of whom who had great hopes invested in this type of government and the ability to reform it and bring it into the 21st century with a different outlook, have paid a dear price. Many of them have been driven out of the country, disappeared, some of them tortured, kept in what can only be described the most sadistic ways from the outside world, etc. And no shortage of dual nationals as pawns in their game as well, hostage-taking galore. That's an important element that the American policymakers have hung on to as well. And this is what, in the conferences we had, the Iranians, had to constantly be reminded by Americans, is that, well, that hostage-taking, that experience has been amplified over and over again by this repeated pattern. And that we cannot just go and shake hands with you or give you what you want in this instance, even though we want to, because it would be rewarding that kind of behavior and with no assurances that it would change. So I would say that that is an important reason why that one cannot simply draw a kind of an equivalence between those two brands of violence. I don't know what my colleagues might think about this.
I don't know. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question of the use of violence?
Well, just one quick addition to that, and that is, one has to understand that there's, as you pointed out, an asymmetry, and it's an enormous asymmetry. I mean, it's not just about military power. It's about the size of the economy. It's about standing in the world and everything else. And as a result of that asymmetry, Iran is much less important to the United States than the United States is to Iran. I mean, there's this tremendous imbalance. In fact, one might say, from the American standpoint, why are we bothering with Iran at all? What's the interest in all this turmoil over the nuclear program? You could say it has to do with Israel and other allies in the region, which is probably pretty close to the answer. But the imbalance between the two countries is very striking and something that we probably don't appreciate here as much as we should.
Let me bring in a question now. Maybe I'll go to Malcolm with this. This is from Max Siegel. He notes the contours of any diplomatic agreement between the US and Iran will be shaped by their respective leaders' domestic political calculations as to what their public and government will accept and what they won't. How do national narratives shape those political calculations? For instance, why does Biden think it would be better politically to let nuclear talks collapse than to make the concession that the Iranians have demanded that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps no longer be designated by the State Department as a foreign terrorist organization? Let's go to Malcolm on that one.
It's a great question, and I think it's in many ways it is sort of the core of the issue of why narratives are a problem. most of the success that has happened in attempts by both sides to reach some sort of agreement with the other. And I think it's useful to remember that every single US president from Jimmy Carter on forward and every major Iranian leader have at one time or another wanted to reach out to the other side, wanted to find some sort of agreement. So yes, we're at each other's throats rhetorically, but both sides understand that they need each other for something, for one thing or another. So why doesn't that work out? Well, it doesn't work out because largely both sides have to contend with these tremendous forces that represent the domestic politics of each country. We did best during Iran-Contra, ironically, when secret talks were being held, and during the roughly 2013 time period when the U.S. and the Iranians were being hosted by the Omanis, and nobody was the wiser. Both sides are fine working behind the scenes, and it's because they know that there's less risk of having to answer to the hardliners in both countries who are just ready. It's like the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, both sides are ready. They have people who are ready to just lob grenades into the process, and with every hope of destroying it. So that's really at the core of the problem. And I think I'll stop there. It's a big question, but maybe my colleagues have other things to add.
I appreciate that answer. And I mean, again, just, from my experience dealing with even the Ahmadinejad administration, one of my trips to Iran, his then national security advisor, Ali Larijani, wanted to set up a back channel with Steve Hadley, who was then our national security advisor, and made a explicit pitch for this kind of back channel talk, which of course did not take place. So I'm not sure, and this is a question whether the current group in power now feels that desire or that need to reach out. Let me get all of you actually to talk about where we are now, because we have these talks that went on in Vienna. They've essentially been stalled since mid-March. The pretext is the IRGC designation, but nobody really believes that's the true answer. There seems to be a tremendous reluctance in Iran to come back into a deal that they feel might unravel again, particularly the Raisi government, which was such a critic of the JCPOA when it was being negotiated by the Rouhani government. And on the US side, as Max Siegel pointed out, Biden is not going to bend over backwards to get this deal back on board. Nobody seems to want to stick a knife in it and say, that's it, you're dead. But this kind of dangerous stalemate continues with Iran, enriching more and more uranium to higher and higher levels. So I'd be curious, maybe starting with you, John, if you could just give your sense of where we are and what, if anything, can get it, going again. Do we need Bill Burns to meet Ali Shamhani in some corner of the Middle East? Maybe not Oman anymore, maybe Baghdad. What could do it? And is there political will to do it? Or are we just going to drift along?
Well, I must say, I wonder if there is a back channel that we'll find out about later. It doesn't appear to be. It's certainly a tight one if there is. My sense is that domestic politics is really has a grip on this now. And I think Biden's enormous mistake was not going forward very quickly as soon as he was inaugurated and not letting domestic politics in this country hamper him. And of course, in Iran, Rouhani was still president at that time. But that's water under the bridge. Right now, I would say the key question is how far Iran is going to go with its enrichment. I don't think they're going to go to 90% because that's going to invite an Israeli attack. And an Israeli attack is probably going to take out the gas centrifuge plant in Isfahan, and that is really the long pole in the tent of the nuclear program, and is of course in a major population area. So that could lead to a much bigger conflagration. So I think the Iranians are sensible enough not to do that. But how you get from where we are to something more positive is very difficult to see. I don't think Biden, given his lack of standing with the American people, apparently, can risk something that would be condemned in a full-throated way by the entire right wing and probably some of the news media. And I don't begin to understand why Iran has not done better at getting to a conclusion of this, given the amount of money involved, if nothing else. But something's holding them back. And again, I think it probably is about suspicions of Americans not coming through and not being actual good partners in negotiation.
Well, we should point out, many people have accused the Iranians of duplicity. Even Wendy Sherman famously testified that there was deceit in their DNA, as I recall, in front of the Senate, a comment for which she later apologized. But let's look at all the times the United States has double-crossed Iran. And one of the things I was struck with in the book was the treatment of Iran. I knew this, I had some inkling of it, but I think you have more detail about how the US double-crossed the Iranians after the Iran-Iraq War, when George H.W. Bush famously said goodwill begets goodwill, and Iran helped engineer the release of American hostages in Lebanon. And the US did nothing in terms of meeting any of its promises, which had been passed to the Iranians, to Rafsanjani, by Giandomenico Pico, the UN envoy who very bravely helped negotiate the release of those remaining hostages. And of course, then the ultimate betrayal, the unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA by Donald Trump, the axis of evil speech of George W. Bush after Iran had helped us set up that government in Afghanistan. So it seems to me that double crossing each other is also a pattern in relations. Perhaps Huss, you could pick that one up.
Yeah, I mean, those are very. You just touched on all the kind of the milestones and the narrative back and forth. Between the two sides, and the Iranians will be very quick to point out those episodes as you pointed them out. I think one of the interesting thing that at least the pattern that you see since the revolution is that the Iranian government is extremely happy with stalemate. It does not necessarily seek progress in the relationship. I mean, my co-authors may disagree with this, but outside of kind of very outlier figures like Mohammad Khatami, who clearly wanted to move the revolution to a different phase, and reformists in general, but they haven't been in power in any measurable way since, one could argue, the first Khatami term. For the rest of the time of post-revolutionary Iran, I think stalemate is something that this regime has been very comfortable with. We did a volume a few years back, and John actually asked me to do a chapter on kind of predictions. This is when Rouhani had just gotten elected, for the future of US-Iran relations. And I kind of reviewed progress, regression, and I settled on stalemate because it clearly is the pattern. And the stalemate here really is, you can see it in response of the Iranians to those periods that you mentioned. Yes, it is true the United States did not follow through, or the Iranians had their pride punctured because someone called them as a member of Axis of Evil. Well, how many times does a supreme leader call the United States everything under the sun? Or every Friday prayer, there are chants of, impending destruction of the state of Israel, or attacks on U.S. bases, etc. United States doesn't hold on to those grudges to kind of advance its interest vis-a-vis Iran. And I think the Iranians are aware of that. So bring this back to the first question with which you started in terms of the state of play right now. I think this administration, the Raisi administration, is very much playing the stalemate card. They have basically made the calculation that the Biden years look a little shaky. There's no guarantee he will get reelected. There's no guarantee that there would be, there would not be, already there have been a number of Senate resolutions kind of condemning it, a deal with Iran, et cetera. And so why kind of waste one's energy on a piece of paper that may not have much value? Let's see what happens if he gets reelected. And the United States in the meantime has no stomach for a war or supporting any kind of military action. And so we will keep our program kind of threatening, but not bring it over the line. And then buy time and see where this goes. They're very shrewd with this. This is a survivalist regime. It has survived for 43 years, and it will explore every opportunity to seek survival, including talks when that serves it. Right now, clearly it doesn't.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think that one of the things too is our electoral calendars usually work in such a way that that we are not in sync. So we've had really only 2 periods when we've had a second-term Democrat as a president in the United States and a first-term Iranian reformist pragmatist. And those are the only times that we've made substantial progress. The rest of the time, we seem to be waiting to see what will happen in the other place, which of course is a recipe for a stalemate. Malcolm, let me come to you with a question that we have from one of our senior fellows at the Atlantic Council, Sina Azodi. He's interested, let's go back a little further to the original American sin for the Iranians, which was the CIA-assisted coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister who had nationalized Iran's oil. And he wants to know what folks think about recent attempts to change the narrative of the 1953 coup to blame Mossadegh more for the coup than the CIA. And the question is for you, Malcolm, because you've obviously done a lot of work to shed light on the history and the role of the CIA in U.S.-Iran relations.
So just clarify, what is the question is?
The question is whether Mossadegh, in fact, was rather more to blame in some ways for his demise, but that we always, we blame it on the CIA. Certainly Iran blames it on the CIA, but there were other factors involved, including Mossadegh's own behavior and of course the flip-flopping clerics and so on. So we've seen some revisionist history in recent years by folks who say, well, you shouldn't just blame the CIA for the fall of Mossadegh.
Right. It's such a fascinating topic, and it's fascinating because of the history and the historiography and how it's been treated and the political angles to it. And Sina's exactly right. It's a key issue. It's for us in terms of looking at narratives. It's one of the biggies, of the modern era. For the Iranians, it's their version of the American original sin, and for us, it's the hostage taking of the embassy seizure in 1979. But this going back to the history that we've seen over the past several years is something that is also part of this kind of narrative framework, because for a number of the people who have been most prominent in revisiting this, there's a political angle to it. And one way that plays out is if you just blame the CIA and MI6, then you're kind of giving the Iranians, something to pummel us with. You're contributing, you're abetting their narrative and their propaganda. Whereas if you look at it as a mostly Iranian, engineered event, then you're putting the blame, you're removing that cudgel from them, and you're putting the blame back where these people believe it belongs, which is with the Iranian people. You're not denying them agency, but you are saying you, the mullahs, whoever, you bear responsibility for this. Stop, distracting everybody and trying to blame it on us. So it has many dimensions to it. And just on the pure history of it, I think that it's one of these cases where you feel like you know less. The more evidence appears, the less you feel like you know about it. But for me and others that have worked on this, some of us, the bottom line is still that this coup couldn't have happened without both sides participating. The Americans and the British for providing funding and support and organization and impetus and so on, and the Iranians of all stripes, including Mossadegh in his way, who contributed. The Shah by deserting the country, Mossadegh by perhaps not being as clever as he should have been and aware of what the dynamics were, and all the other factors, the army and the Majlis and so on, all playing a part in a very complex historical event.
Thanks. I think one thing that also a lot of people don't understand is the climate in the United States at the time, where we had just, quote unquote, lost China to the communists, and the tremendous fear of the Soviet Union becoming the most important power in Iran, and that this was too precious a chip to let the Russians take.
Can I just raise one tiny interesting little historical moment there?
Sure.
When you speak of losing China, so Asia was a big issue back then. And in June 1950, when Harry Truman was still president, there was a moment where a young official was in the office, maybe the Oval Office, with Truman alone, and ventured to ask the president what he thought about the risks of the North Korean invasion for Formosa and for other parts of Asia. And what does Truman do? He walks over to a big globe and puts his finger on Iran. And he says, this is where I'm worried about, because if we let the communists get away with this over there, then the next thing they're going to do is they're going to try it over here. And that's where we have to be worried. It's just a great little insight into kind of the global nature of the Cold War and how Iran has figured in American strategic thinking for decades.
Yeah. Let me ask John, if looking at the geopolitical situation now and how that has changed regarding Iran, if Iran didn't have a frightening nuclear program, would we care that Iran seems to have decided to, quote unquote, go east and cast its lot with the Russians and the Chinese, fellow authoritarians, and to maintain that alliance, passing up the benefits of sanctions relief from the United States and so on? Do we care that this coalition of the sanctions seems to be forming? And is it only the nuke program that really still concerns us? And I'll welcome other people thinking about this as well, but I'll start with you, John.
Well, I think we care because of oil.
Still.
And that Europe needs oil. We don't buy Iranian oil, at least not directly. And so it's always going to be important in that sense. Saudi Arabia has moved east, so to speak, over the last 15 or 20 years, I think, very dramatically. If you look at trade figures with China, including petroleum, but other things too, this is something that many of these Gulf countries are doing. So it's, and of course, there wouldn't be sanctions on Iran if they didn't have a nuclear program. I just one more point on this, and I think that Iran's nuclear program is a failure in terms of U.S. non-proliferation policy, as has Pakistan, as has India. We are failing, and we're failing pretty miserably, really, when we come, as we've been talking about, to the brink of war about this program, which doesn't really pose a risk to U.S. national security. So that's something to keep in mind too, is why have we failed so miserably in containing something that policymakers identify as being important?
Mm. Um, I'll go to my other speakers, but let me add on something here because, I mean, one of the reasons we care, obviously, is because Israel cares. And this is just a question that reading your book, I was rereading the speech that Martin Indyk gave to the Washington Institute of Near East Policy when he declared a policy of dual containment against both Iran and Iraq in, I guess it was 1993. And reading his speech, I was reminded of Mike Pompeo's speech in 2018, laying out 12 demands for Iran to behave like a quote unquote normal nation. I mean, they absolutely sprang from the same inspiration that it's not our fault, it's Iran. It just won't act like it should act. And be more respectful of the interests of our friends and partners in the Middle East. So the question is, how can the US and Iran, or can we not really ever have a proper relationship when Israel and Iran are essentially at war? I was struck, there was a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. There have been 400 Israeli attacks on Iranians and Iranian-related targets in Syria since 2017. And of course, I think there have been 7 scientists now in Iran that have been killed over the last couple of weeks. And the intelligence minister of Iran apparently has just been removed, according to the rumors, at least on social media. So is it Israel that is at the heart of this? Or is it our wounded pride that Iran will not act as we think a civilized, quote unquote, country should act?
Can I take a stab at that?
Yeah, take a stab, and then I'll go to Malcolm on that.
That's a very shrewd observation, Barbara, first of all, about the kind of pre-nuclear program Iran and how we found something to dislike about the Islamic Republic. And I think that has to do something not just about the way the United States looks at a regime that it hadn't had to reckon with in the post-war period, a kind of a revolutionary political Islam-oriented a regime that is defiant in ways that we've never seen before. And the United States has that problem with all sorts of Islamic governments, not just Iran. It's a very difficult thing to come to terms with when you're dealing with, especially a millenarian Shia ideology that captures the state and executes a whole bunch of people who used to party with you in Washington and in Tehran and elsewhere, et cetera. Those social ties really were that deep in pre-revolutionary US-Iran relations. But I do think, coming to your question about Israel, I think it's less a question of, this is my own view, I've evolved on this greatly from the original position I used to hold, which was, yeah, Israel seems to just want to box Iran. But I do think Iran's, at least public narrative about Israel, is really, if you think about it, unjustified in a kind of a rules-based system that really everyone should be appalled by. I mean, you look at the Arab countries right now and their kind of evolving relationship with Israel. It's, they've moved away from similar narratives in the 70s and 80s. I used to travel in the Middle. I remember in the 80s what they used to say about the Israelis, Jews in Riyadh, in Jordan, etc. Those narratives have changed, and you see the Israeli response has also changed. One interesting tidbit that I think it was Tom Bickering who told us this when he was in government, when Yitzhak Rabin was the defense minister of Israel during the Iran-Iraq war. He told us that he used to travel to Washington, twice a month. And in every meeting, he used to warn American officials not to tilt too much toward Saddam, that Iranians had a historical affinity with the Israeli people, and he wanted to preserve that. He very much hoped that there would be room that there would be room in Iran more than any other Arab country. Or other
more than any other Middle Eastern country.
Middle Eastern countries, rather.
Arab.
Thank you.
Yes.
and that this was almost like a passing fever, the Islamic Revolution, that we should see through the lines, that even they would be able to kind of reconcile those differences. So I think it really, the onus here for me is on the Iranian government that has taken this very unbending position, which it has now militarized as a basis for recruitment regionally, but also for ever expanding budget of the Revolutionary Guards and their elite Quds unit. I mean, these are really true shadow-like entities that have bottomless budgets at the cost of, maintaining the environment, maintaining basic services in Iran. We can't overlook this. This is not a simple matter of the Israel lobby doing its thing in Washington. The Iranians are very much, this regime, or at least these elements that have benefited handsomely from antagonizing Israel, or kind of keeping that antagonism up, have benefited handsomely, and that has to change as well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that Iran is the only country now that uses the sort of Nasserite rhetoric of, throw them into the sea occasionally. You're absolutely right in terms of the rhetoric, and also in terms of the policy of supporting these various groups that are opposed to Israel. And I wonder, maybe I'll turn this to you, Malcolm. What will it take for that to change? Does it take the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, who literally wraps himself in a keffiyeh, and who is very, very, very anti-Israel, at least in his statements? Or will this persist even as much of the Arab world, and probably soon even Saudi Arabia, recognize the reality of Israel?
Well, I think it's another fascinating question. I think Israel fits neatly into our sort of perception of things, or our lens, the way that we're framing this, just for people's for people to think about, because it is a key part of the audience for U.S. politicians. Domestic, foreign is kind of a hybrid, but it is a player that American politicians are always going to have to factor into their thinking. But it doesn't mean that things cannot change. Perceived interests, national interests, are not permanent. Again, take a look at Iran-Contra. The Israelis were key to that whole thing, coming into play. David Kimche and others, and Shimon Peres, they wanted to help the Americans, and they had this idea that it might serve their interest to kind of cozy up to people inside Iran. At that point, Iraq was their big threat, perceived existential threat. Now things have changed, but that means that things could go back to the way they were, to a point where members of the political leadership in Israel and in the U.S., or even possibly Iran, to the extent that leadership is critical to pushing any of these initiatives and to the success of any deals of this sort, then the possibility of new leadership coming into power in any of these three, or all three of these countries, is something that we should keep in mind. That could change things. The perception of a new reality on the ground is something that has historically always been a factor, whether it was 1953 or the Iran-Iraq War, or other examples that you could come up with. The perception that things have changed and we need to adjust to it is something that leaders in all three of these countries have shown they're capable of working with and adapting to. So I don't see it as anything near an impossibility or anything near permanent, the state of play that we have now. But the timing of it is, that's anybody's guess, obviously.
Yeah, we should also point out that ordinary Iranians, many of them do not share this animosity toward Israel, and that many people in Iran, listen to Israeli broadcasts in Farsi. The Voice of Israel in Farsi language. There's a very, very large Iranian Jewish diaspora that's based in Israel, and folks get to see each other in places like Cyprus and whatnot. So this is really regime rhetoric. This is regime ideology. It's used domestically, and it's also used to recruit this Shia Foreign Legion of groups all through the Middle East. John, do you have anything to say about the Israel factor and what could affect it?
I'm not sure what could affect it. I do think that it's interesting to consider that Israel is also a settler nation. And so they share that kind of outlook with the United States. In the United States, I think the pro-Israel lobby has adopted many of the tropes that we're talking about with respect to, savages and, usually in terms of mad mullahs and other things that are maybe a tiny bit more subtle. The use of the word terrorist is kind of a substitute for savage, basically. And so you see at least the right wing of Israel and pro-Israeli people here, which now is pretty dominant, really using some of the things we're talking about as in terms of national narratives to forward a case for regime change, basically.
I think in fairness, though, we have to say that again, it's the asymmetry and the different use of violence. So the Israelis assassinate Abbas Musawi, the head of Hezbollah, in 1992. And what does Iran do? It gets Hezbollah to kill Argentinian Jews, people at the Israeli embassy in Argentina, and also later people at a community center in Argentina.
See, that's a sign of weakness. So.
It may be a sign of weakness, but there are other examples. Israeli tourists on a bus in Bulgaria. Meanwhile, the Israelis go about methodically mowing down Iranian scientists in Iran. And we just had recent reports of Israeli tourists in Turkey being warned that they could be targets because Iran is furious that Israel is carrying out all these attacks, and it's not able to do the same damage within Israel without unleashing Hezbollah and its 100,000 rockets, which of course would start a massive Middle East war. So, it's narratives, it's language, but it's also fact that the methods in which these two countries go after each other differs. Although I would argue that assassinating a scientist, a rocket scientist, or even a nuclear scientist in Iran is a kind of terrorism. But of course, the Israelis would disagree.
Can I chime in on that? I think the kind of corollary to that would be that, if Iran does similar things where it's a balance of power relationship with respect to other political entities in the region, Shia militia, Sunni groups in Iraq and Syria, it has behaved much the same way in terms of, and I think this is one of those kind of realities of just, balance of power, is that I have no doubt that if Iranians had a hidden nuclear program with 250 nuclear warheads ready to go, and Israel was the country that was aiming to kind of, put a nuclear program together and constantly gesturing that it wanted to wipe Iran off the map, that the Iranians would be doing the same thing. They would be assassinating Israeli, they had the capability, they would do it. The question here is why it is that Iran continues to pursue this at the great cost of damaging its other far more important national interests, not to mention its own citizenry, that are patently against this kind of narrative and posturing toward Israel. And as long as Israel and the United States have that public sentiment on their side, I think it makes it a lot easier for them to hold on to these double standards. Because again, going back to the original first question you asked, is that their brand of violence is something that is they perceive within the rules-based system, whereas Iran's is not even respecting their own domestic rules, let alone those of others. And I think that's been a problem since 1979. It's the kind of the revolutionary fervor that Iran hasn't been able to moderate, and there's been no shortage of casts of characters, some of whom we've interviewed, who've tried to moderate, desperately so, and haven't been able to succeed much, and sometimes because we misread the situation, the United States did. And I think this is, I mean, I grew up in Iran, I should discuss, until I was 15, and I left the day before, like many people of my age, the day before I was due for military service. And I remember, that hard decade of the Iran-Iraq war, or the 8 years of it, and the kind of spillover, just how angry the public was at what the Iranian leaders were doing to make their domestic situation more miserable.
Yeah.
And that's something that we don't tend to think much in terms of the considerations that this regime has, both domestically and regionally and internationally. We tend to only look at the international picture with the nuclear program, for instance, but they're constantly balancing these different competing centers of threat on their authority, on their legitimacy, and that's a hydra-headed monster. It's not an easy thing to come to terms with, which is why you need kind of learned but also dogged American leadership. The Obama years, to me, were especially unique because they were so focused. The focus of that administration, from before even they came into office, was on one thing and one thing only: arms control, separate everything out, just make sure that we establish some measure of trust on this one issue so that we can expose all these other ancillary issues that have nothing to do with this. What did Pompeo do with his 12 points? Bring all those ancillary points and slap them on something that it didn't apply to, which was, as you mentioned, the status quo ante under Clinton, under George H.W. Bush, and Reagan, of course.
Yeah, the kitchen sink approach to dealing with Iran never works, I think we've learned that over time. So we're unbelievably running out of time, which is incredible. I could talk to you guys forever. This is just so fascinating. I did want to raise one thing in the book, which I found was So you have in the book that Ryan Crocker, a very distinguished former American diplomat, who talked to numerous Iranians after 9/11, mostly about Afghanistan, but about other issues as well, that he had met Qasem Soleimani in Geneva in the fall of 2001. And I talked to Ryan because I thought I knew almost everything about these back channel talks that had gone on at the time. And he said, no, he'd never met Qasem Soleimani. And I had thought that Soleimani never left. I mean, I knew he went to Russia to get the Russians to intervene in Syria and so on, but I thought he basically stayed in the neighborhood. And talking with Ryan said he was told by an Iranian diplomat that, in fact, Qasem Soleimani had gone to Geneva in the fall of 2001, attended a conference regarding Afghanistan, and he had gone incognito. Nobody knew that the head of the Quds Force was actually in Geneva. So I stood corrected on my first instinct on that. I think the role of Qasem Soleimani, and there have been some books written about him, but none have really caught the nuances of this guy and the way in which his views were shaped over time. Because, as you rightly point out in your book, he was all for cooperation with the United States after 9/11, certainly saw the benefit of working with the US to get rid of the Taliban, which was an Iranian enemy at the time, and one might argue still is to some extent. And of course, even on Iraq, there were if the US was so determined to go in and get rid of Saddam Hussein, there were certainly Iranians who were supporting that and might have actually worked with us instead of against us if Iran had not been put on the take a number regime change list along with Saddam Hussein. So any final thoughts on Qasem Soleimani and his role? Obviously, his killing was shocking, and we were talking in the lead up to this event about the differences between the George W. Bush approach to Iran and the Donald Trump approach to Iran, which was sort of like George W. Bush on steroids, I think. Go for it and give us your final thoughts. Let me maybe go reverse order. Let's start with Huss, and then we'll go to Malcolm and John to finish up.
Yeah, thanks for that correction and also discovery. I mean, this is what's lovely about events like this, that you get even more context to that. And Ryan Crocker, as Malcolm mentioned in the pre-conversation we had before this panel, never gave us an interview. So this is wonderful to hear in terms of exactly that. And I would have to check that, because like you, Barbara, I was under the impression that he'd never left Iran or the region, and Russia was the only place that he'd ever been to. Soleimani, I mean, after he was assassinated, I wrote a piece that I argued it's actually very difficult to, in my view, think of his legend absent the Bush administration. Mm-hmm. George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq really made this person the kind of legend that he became in the Revolutionary Guards and in Iran, and maybe beyond that in the region. It's one of those unintended consequences that the United States has paid for dearly. Iran's rising profile, but really his rising profile, owes everything to that band of neoconservatives who thought they were ushering in an era of democracy and universal human rights in the region. It did the absolute opposite. And I have, and he was this kind of, actor on that stage. It's a kind of a Shakespearean drama almost, that he's born of that moment and he kind of goes into that role, and he wreaks violence and havoc with abandon on many parts of the region. And all the while gets to rebrand this entity that had really fallen to the side, the Revolutionary Guard Support Force, as the kind of guardians of this David versus Goliath battle, and inserts this new stream of commentary into the narrative. The narrative of kind of, we are just trying to fight for our own survival and against imperialism, and et cetera, et cetera. And that is a legacy of the Bush administration for me. I mean, and there are many other Qasem Soleimanis, but for me, it really underlines that point. And that, as the final thought here for me, when I look at this relationship, I'm ever more convinced that the most important player here, because of the asymmetry of power, because of its singular role and imprint in the world, is the United States.
Sure.
And the reason why we started this project was to really try to force the public policy community to look within, not to empathize with the Iranians in every situation, but to really see how American policy, when it proceeds on unthinking premises, can make not only the livelihoods of countless, billions of others miserable, but also damage American national interests, and all on the basis of a long-standing foundational myth that it is meant to tame the frontier, bring order to the world, which is really a misbegotten background condition here.
Yeah, as Condi Rice said in the Situation Room in spring of 2003, we're going to remake the Middle East like we did Germany and Japan after World War II. You want to look at chutzpah. It's pretty breathtaking. Malcolm, Soleimani, his legend, his role, any final thoughts on where we are now?
This has just been a really fun discussion, and your questions are great, and the questions from the audience, would love to keep them coming. I'll try to keep this pretty brief. The Soleimani story is so fascinating. I'm waiting to hear about more of the detail and the nuances and so on. And that back channel that he was part of, he may not have met directly, but it was, maybe 1 degree of separation.
No, there was a Quds Force representative in the talks.
Yeah. And by Crocker's accounts and by other accounts, there was a lot of eagerness on the Iranian side to get the Americans to act, to work together, and so on. And as we know, And as you would read in this book, you'll see many examples of this kind of thing that might surprise some people. I mean, talk about a missed opportunity. It's just a great example of that as well. But what strikes me as interesting about all of these episodes, the assassination of Soleimani and the scientists, and assassinations on all sides. The Iranians certainly have done their share. The sabotage, the other attacks, all of that has been going on steadily, has so far not made any of the sides say, that's it, enough, we're done. We're not going to deal with these kinds of things. They are all, even the Israelis have not yet struck in a way that dooms these talks or the notion of some kind of set of agreements, or God knows, rapprochement, or something down the road. So if you're looking for any glimmer of a prospect of something coming out of these talks in particular, ask yourself that question. Why have these kinds of events not spelled doom for the process so far?
John, you get the last word.
Well, on Soleimani, I would say that there's more than one interesting thing, but I'll just mention one, that is that the murder of Soleimani was really the fulfillment, in a way, of the frontier thesis again. Just hasten to point that out. And also the people like us were predicting that Iran would really do something very powerful to take revenge for that killing. They never really did, which also illustrates what we were talking about before, which is the asymmetry of power and Iran's essential weakness in terms of that kind of military capability. Finally, I'd say about the prospects for a better relationship, it don't look good now, that's for sure. And I'm particularly disappointed with Biden's performance on this. I think we're going to get more of the same when he visits Israel. The decision to not simply go for a renewal of the nuclear pact is really one of the most peculiar things we've seen in foreign policy in recent years when he was first president. And I think we need a critical oral history conference to unpack that.
Well,
thank you, Barbara.
I would look forward to that. This has been the fastest hour and a half I have spent on Zoom. So I hope it's been the same for you. Again, it's a terrific book, Republics of Myth. And I really thank everyone who's joined us, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Our next event is going to be on the relationship between Iran and Iraq. So stay tuned. We may revisit some of these themes. Again, thank you to my speakers, and thank you to everyone who joined us.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.